Hello, I'm Juliet Antonio.
I'm Aaron Isaac.
And welcome to another installment of Where's the Director? Because we'd like to have a word with them. And today, we're going to the village of Anatevka because we are talking about Fiddler on the Roof. So, let's get into the background. Fiddler on the Roof is a 1964 musical based on the short stories of Tevye the Milkman by the Yiddish author and playwright Sholem Aleichem. Set in the shtetl of Anatevka, the show tells the story of Tevye trying to maintain his Jewish religious and cultural traditions as the outside world begins to encroach on the lives of his family. The story also centers on his three eldest daughters, shtetl, shtetl, and Hava, all of whom want to defy tradition by marrying for love. As for how Fiddler came to be, composer Jerry Bach and lyricist Sheldon Harnick approached book writer Joe Stein about adapting Aleichem's Wandering Stars into a musical. Stein didn't feel the book could be adapted well and suggested the stories of Tevye he loved so much as a boy. The songwriting team fell in love with the English translations they found and decided to make a show. The title came from a painting of a fiddler on the roof by the Russian-French artist Marc Chagall. When it came time to find a producer, Stein said he knew it would be difficult. Quote, "You're doing a musical about old Jews in the pogrom. What are you, crazy?" Eventually, producer Hal Prince agreed to take them on and suggested New York City ballet choreographer Jerome Robbins, formerly Rabinowitz, to direct after the two of them had a smash hit with West Side Story. It should be noted, everyone was terrified of Robbins because he was legendary for eviscerating people, once telling the actor playing model that he had to leave while watching the wedding scene because, quote, "The idea of you being married to that young woman made me sick." The only one who really didn't get along with him was the man who originated the role of Tevye, Zero Mostel, whom Robbins himself wanted for the role because he was a larger-than-life performer. Things were tense in the rehearsal room because, in the 1950s, Robbins testified before HUAC on behalf of the government and gave names, which a lot of performers, including Mostel, never forgave him for. What most people didn't know was that after 3 years of holding out, the government threatened to out Robbins as a gay man if he continued to evade them. But everyone admired him because of his ability to make Fiddler a universal story and for his genius. As Stein said, a man who could make a dance like that, you could forgive him for anything. The show did out-of-town tryouts in Detroit, where it was panned by the critics, with Variety magazine infamously declaring that the show had no memorable songs. Yeah.
Okay, sure. All right, whatever you say, pal.
With cutting, pasting, and editing, Fiddler received glowing reviews when it premiered in Washington, but still only managed to obtain mixed reviews when it opened on Broadway at the Imperial on September 22nd, 1964, with Walter Kerr calling it a near miss in the New York Times. But if you went outside the Imperial, the line snaked around the block, and they were so long that Hal Prince actually handed out cups of coffee to people waiting in the cold. It was a hit, running for 3,242 performances. In 1971, United Artists released the screen adaptation of Fiddler on the Roof, which we'll be talking about today. The film was directed by Norm Jewison, who made the producers silent for a long time over the phone when he told them he wasn't Jewish. And Tevye, this time, was played by Israeli actor Chaim Topol because Jewison wanted to cast a first-generation Jewish immigrant, and he thought Topol's performance was close to the reality of the character. It also felt like an appropriate choice for Tevye 7 years later with the tectonic shifts in culture and following the Six-Day War in Israel in 1967. The film was also shot mostly in Eastern Europe, so it would have the authenticity lacking on movie sets. Upon its release, the film garnered a total of $83.8 million worldwide and ran in country for years. I mean, in Japan it ran for 3 years, Spain 3 or 4, and in places all around the world you wouldn't think it would run, but did because the movie allowed for Fiddler's universal story to be accessible to everybody. In 2020, it was announced that there would be a remake of the film, directed by Hamilton's Tom McHale, to which the entire internet said a resounding, "No thanks." Fiddler has gone on to be one of the most beloved musicals of all time that almost everyone knows a song from. Many famous men have played Tevye the Milkman, including Alfred Molina, Doc Ock, Harvey Fierstein, and Mr. Spock himself, Leonard Nimoy. Pre-COVID, there was always a production of Fiddler playing somewhere around the world, from a black and Puerto Rican junior high school in the 1970s, to present-day Japan, to universities in Thailand, and to the real Anatevka in Kiev, Ukraine, at the Sholem Aleichem Museum for an audience of refugees. So, with that being said, Aaron, where do you want to start?
Well, first of all, the screenplay you sent me, the film, it's 3 hours.
Yes, it is. That's why I said, Aaron, watch this over 2 days.
So we obviously won't get to everything.
Nope.
But one of the things I found interesting isn't so much anything, not any specific scene, but the idea of tradition that gets brought up and is challenged throughout the whole film. It's the theme of the film. And existentialism, it has how should I say, oppositional view of tradition in general.
Sense. Yeah.
Right? So there's two parts of this. One is the actual movements that existentialism inspires post World War II. When you start talking to people like Simone de Beauvoir and Paul Sartre, they're very involved in things like women's liberation, decolonialism, and existentialism as a movement in Europe was very much, you can think of it as like a rebel kind of attitude.
Yeah, like Pritchik.
Yeah. But there's a wider philosophical problem existentialism has with tradition that just starts from the beginning. When you start talking about how Soren Kierkegaard saw things, because it is odd because there were some traditions Kierkegaard would hold on to, like going to church and things. Although even going to church in his Danish context, he might have a problem with. But the idea of maintaining your beliefs, believing in God, and these kinds of values. Kierkegaard would hold on to them, but he kind of viewed tradition as oppositional to the individual spirit. And what do I mean by that? So Kierkegaard, I think, says it the most succinctly, and it's as succinct as he ever gets. When he says, life is understood backwards, but always lived forward. Yeah. And what he's saying there, I've heard a lot of people say that, he's saying, learn from your mistakes and live forward. That's not really what he's saying. What he's saying is you can try to understand your past, but when you do, you're perpetually moving forward. Yeah. So whenever you try to do that, the moment escapes you. The idea being, there's no fixed understanding of yourself. And since there's no fixed understanding, tradition and maintaining tradition, the idea of that falls apart pretty quickly. Yeah. When you go back to the idea of a fiddler on the roof, right? The opening to the film,
which is perfect.
No, it's pretty good because it sets the scene for the entire film.
Yes, as an opening number should.
Yeah, you get exactly what this film is about in that first song, tradition. And the idea is people are fiddlers on the roof in that they're precarious and they could tip over at any point. And by the end of the film, and Kierkegaard would agree with this, it turns out that tradition is the fiddler on the roof. Yes. It's always precarious and it's always in a position to just fall apart.
Which is why at the end of the movie, you see that the fiddler follows Tevye and his family on the way out as they leave Anatevka. So just a bit of a thing on tradition itself, and one of the other reasons that it works as an opening number, it was Jerome Robbins would always ask the composers, what is this show about? What gives these stories their power? Until one day they all snapped and said, oh, for God's sake, Jerry, it's about tradition. To which Robbins responded, good, write that. And so one of the many reasons that it works is it unlocks everything the show needs. It gives the audience an education about the culture. And people, when they talk about Fiddler the Roof, they say there was no nostalgia for the shtetl. It was, people have described it as like a hellhole. But with this opening number, you see it as a place and as a community and not just a place to be fled. And in this number, for them, tradition is about holding on to what will give life, and it lists the roles that the villagers play in society. The papa, the mama, the sons, and the daughters, according to traditions. And as Tevye said, and as we mentioned, life without them would be as shaky as a fiddler on the roof. And you mentioned tradition and opposition earlier. So it kind of makes me want to talk about Tevye's daughters a little bit.
Yeah, let's do it.
And because also you talked about Simone de Beauvoir and feminism. And Fiddler opened less than a year after The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan was published. And Harnack said the women's movement in the 60s affected him subconsciously, and his thinking found his way into his lyrics, which is why many people say Fiddler is a women's empowerment piece. And you could argue that the inciting incident of the whole play is when Yenta, the matchmaker, shows up and says that Laser Wolf wants to marry shtetl. And for shtetl, this is her breaking point because she doesn't want the matchmaker. She wants to choose for herself, and she wants the tailor model Camzoil. And forced marriages in plays and musicals go back to Shakespeare. Now, it's also interesting that we see this. Jan Lisa Hunter called this song Matchmaker, the I Want song for Tevye's daughters, a mini drama in 3 acts. Because you have 1, the dream, the girls don't have a clue and they're dreaming about their future, and you hear a lyrical waltz. Act 2, the rude awakening from shtetl, with my favorite lyric, oh, I have a match for you. He's handsome. He's young. All right, he's 62, which makes the sisters go, hold on, what? Then you have Act 3, the battle cry, which is we will take charge of our own story and we won't become a product of Yenta's business. And Sholem Aleichem famously hated matchmakers. He thought that they were not honorable. It wasn't an honest profession, according to him. And there was one story that involved a matchmaker engaging with human trafficking in Argentina. And in historical records, which they showed in the documentary Miracle of Miracles about Fiddler's making, you see the historical records of some of the women who went to Argentina and became prostitutes because it was either that or death. And so we see these daughters' 3 journeys, which I think, in terms of a subplot in a musical, intertwine with the main plot of Tevye and the village of Anatevka really well. And it's because that Tevye has daughters he loves, he goes with the times and he goes against tradition. Because when he looks into shtetl and Huddle's eyes, he cannot refuse them. And he yells at tradition each time, like as if to say, damn it, damn you. And when tradition doesn't strike back, you can see him kind of looking around. He gives them his blessing and his permission. Well, for those 2 anyway. Hava's another story, which we might get to later.
Yeah. So, you talked a little bit about Simone de Beauvoir and the connection to women's civil rights and women's liberation and feminist movement. Yeah, that stuck out in the beginning of the film, and it stuck throughout up to the last daughter, whose name is, again?
Hava.
Hava? Okay. I'll never be able to pronounce these names. I can barely pronounce regular English. But anyway.
It's okay.
But anyhow, the point, it's interesting to see how tradition, at least that tradition, really, it stuck on one end, if we're still playing with the Fiddler on the Roof analogy. One of the things that held it up is that some people would benefit from this tradition. First of all, the matchmaker gets a job.
Yeah.
60-year-old men can marry what I hope are 20-somethings, but I'm not that naive. But the other side of the Fiddler, which is which threatens to upset it, is that this inevitably infringes on the self-determination of the people subject to the tradition, right? So, if you're a young woman in that village, you don't get a say in what happens to you.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because, aside from the daughters, there's this moment, and I forget the wife's name offhand. I believe it's Golda,
yes.
Yeah. She's asked, "Do you love me?"
Which is one of my favorite songs. Oh.
And I'm that sentence was like, oh my God, this tradition. You really get the sense that they really believe in it and they have stood by it for 25 years through their marriage. They never thought about, do they love each other?
And her first response is, do I what? Because it's just so out of left field for her.
Right. The question of love is not a question in marriage. You're just set up.
Yeah. And about Do You Love Me in particular, which I call the realization song, both for Tevye and for Golda, it was actually added to the show in Detroit because when Harnick heard the actress playing respond, "Do I what?" he realized there was a song there. And it's always hilarious, but it reminds me of something that my grandfather told me about his parents. He said they never said "I love you" out loud, but they showed they loved their children with their actions. So there was never any doubt. And there's no doubt here, in my opinion, when this song starts to unfold, because they're equals who are able to mess with each other. And I believe if it wasn't an arranged marriage, they still would have found each other anyway, because to quote C.S. Lewis, they were so used to quarreling and making it up again that they got married so as to go on doing it more conveniently. And Golda says the important line, "For 25 years I've lived with him, fought with him, starved with him. 25 years my bed is his. If that's not love, I don't know what is." And it shows that Tevye's father was right, which it doesn't happen in all arranged marriage scenarios, but they did learn to love each other because they've been through so much. And you see in that song the children, they were on their wedding day when both of them were scared to death. Only this time both of them are afraid of Golda's response. And one actress who played Golda said it's because she's afraid to name her emotions, otherwise they'll take away her ability to reason through life, which I thought was interesting. It's like she doesn't have time to sit and think. She has to do the chores. She has to be there for her husband, make sure her daughters get married. And then it ends with the beautiful lines, "It doesn't change a thing, but even so, after 25 years, it's nice to know." Because in their hearts they've always known, but it means so much to the both of them just to hear it out loud. And it still feels romantic in the midst of 3 other love stories because it's an older couple recognizing the meaning of love, which isn't something that you see that much in media. So it's really touching in that moment.
I'm going to take the touching moment away now.
Oh, great.
So, what do you think would have happened if she said no?
Oh.
It's completely probable.
She could
Probable,
have, yeah.
I don't know, but it's certainly possible that you go through life and you don't ask the question that's most important to you, right? You don't ask if you love this other person. That's just how you live.
I think we would have seen definitely an angrier Tevye over the course of the play, because he doesn't really become set in stone angry until what happens to Hava. But I think he would have turned into a different man. He doesn't really take things out on his family, or tries not to. You know, he'll snap, but he doesn't he doesn't lambaste them. He never lays a hand on them. And I think we would have seen, I think the musical would have ended in a way. No, it would have ended because that would have been, you can't really go anywhere from that moment.
I think he is, Tevye is unique in the village because, and the reason he's the main character is because he is willing to look past tradition to cement the happiness of his daughters.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, the thought I had, and the reason I asked you is, if he had realized my wife isn't happy because we follow tradition, would he have the same opinion of tradition at the end of the film? When he doesn't kind of reconcile, but he doesn't act the same to all his daughters, if you want to talk about that.
Oh, you know, I think it would have been, he would have had the same reaction as he does during Little Bird, Little Havilah, but for different reasons. So I just want to talk about that really quick.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, so Tevye's daughters, shtetl, she wants to marry a poor tailor. He's Jewish. He loves shtetl. Tevye does some thinking. He finds out that they gave each other a pledge, which is unheard of. But he looks in his daughter's eyes, sees that she loves him, and he says, "Okay, I give you my blessing." You have Huddle, who wants to marry the revolutionary Perchik. They ask for his blessing, but not his permission, to which he says, "shtetl and Matel at least begged me, but you want me to give you my blessing and not my permission?" But then again, he looks in his daughter's eyes, sees that she's happy, and Perchik is a radical, but he's still Jewish, and he's doing important things in the world, and he is a good man, which Tevye recognizes. So he says, "Okay, you have my blessing and my permission." with Hava, she falls in love with Fiedka, who is not Jewish. And she hints to her father, I think I have feelings for this man because they both like to read together. They like books. Personally, I don't like the way that... I don't really like Fiedka as much as the other love interests in the film, because the way he enters the movie with the boys bothering Hava and him just saying, all right, that's enough, and still kind of being a bit of a creep. Not exactly a fan.
Yeah, well, sure, but he doesn't really have much of a role anyhow. He's just kind of the stand-in guy.
Yeah, so Tevye says you can't marry outside the faith, because it's not that if she was to marry him, it wouldn't be that she's just leaving the faith. She'd be an apostate. She renounces the faith. And so Tevye finds out that Hava and Fiedka eloped, and she was baptized, and they were married in the Russian Orthodox Church. And Tevye, throughout this whole play, believes that if they follow the path God laid out for them, everything will be okay. And Hava's fate is Tevye's ultimate fear, that she will leave the religion because it's all he can give her and his family, which is why he clings to that in tradition so much, because he has no money, no land, this is all. And at first Tevye thinks, well, I can accept this because Russians and Jews are both human beings, but he's part of this earthbound world, and all of his instincts as a human being tell him no. And after this song, he never speaks to God again. Because
I didn't recognize that.
Because
You're right.
He can't believe this was allowed to happen. And Harvey Fierstein said this about If I Were a Rich Man. He said, God is Tevye's best friend, and he's Tevye's only male friend, because the only other men are his daughter's husbands, the rabbi, the constable, and Lazar Wolf. And at home, Tevye is surrounded by women. And if you look at it at like a friendship, God teases him mercilessly until it's no longer funny. And, Tevye ribs him a little bit, like, would it spoil some vast eternal plan if I were a wealthy man? But he never speaks to God again because he can't believe that this was allowed to happen. And this time when it's shot in the film, we don't see him looking at Hava's eyes. We see Tevye's eyes, and they are filled with nothing but pain. And what I also like about this scene is we really get to see storytelling through dance, with shtetl, shtetl, and Hava dancing away towards their men. And when Hava's about to go with Fiedka, the fiddler shows up. Mm-hmm. And she hesitates as the fiddler pulls her closer with the violin, but she runs off to her man, who spins her around in his arms in a very intimate gesture we don't see with the other men. Not even with Perchik, because when he breaks tradition by dancing with Huddle, it's because more of their intimacy is intellectual, recognizing each other as equals. And it's heartbreaking because in the family, she was the family favorite, a la you were the chosen one in Star Wars. And it's even more heartbreaking because if you think about, she says we're going to Krakow at the end of the movie. When you think what was about to happen in Poland during World War II, it didn't matter who the hell she was married to. Mm-hmm. And Hava doesn't understand what she's done because she sees it as the same as her sisters and as a romance out of her books. But when she's baptized as an Orthodox to get married, there is a door closed by her father that can never be reopened because reconversion isn't a thing, and you can't exactly flip-flop if faith is the cornerstone of your life. And the composers found this the hardest part of the show to write, and that Tevye considering her dead made sense because that's the only way he can cope with this. And everyone in this moment is either Team Tevye or Team Hava. And one time, when Fiddler on the Roof was revived in about 2017, and Danny Burstein's during one show when he said the line, Hava is dead to us, a woman in the audience shouted, yes! And started clapping, which really threw the poor man for a loop, and he was like,
You're not supposed to cheer there.
No, he just kept performing the show, poor man. But, yeah, I think that's the moment where, and there's a line where Tevye says, if I bend this much, I will break. And he makes the decision that goes along with tradition and what he was told, but he's still very much a broken man.
Well, and that leads to the end of the film where the fiddler is next to them. Playing is I forget offhand what he had, but
violin, fiddle?
Yeah,
fiddler.
Just leave me alone. It's raining out here. That's what I'm going to blame that brain fart on.
Yeah, it is very gray and cloudy.
It is, yeah. Mm-hmm. So, okay, there was one other thing I wanted to touch on concerning Fiddler on the Roof. Mm-hmm. Specifically, the the strange, it's not really strange. I just didn't expect it. Although given the time, I guess it makes sense. The Marxist.
Perchik, which fun fact.
Perchik, yeah.
I sent, before we discovered that we were doing this podcast, I found a clip of the proposal, of Perchik's proposal on TikTok, and I sent it to Aaron, and I said, I can see you proposing to a girl this way. And I remember I also...
Marriage has a certain socioeconomic base.
And affection.
Yes, that's true. That's important, too.
What I'm saying is, I would very much like to pursue this socioeconomic relationship. I think you're asking me to marry you?
Something like that.
I have a theory that if you could tell that your child is a budding leftist, if their crush in the Fiddler on the Roof movie was Perchik.
Oh, God,
Am I wrong?
I'm not gonna say anything.
Okay, drink your tea.
But anyway, it's interesting because it lets me connect existentialism to Marxism, which is not done much. I'll be very brief.
Yep.
So the connection between the two really has to do with Sartre. Because he, over time, after his big book, Being in Nothingness, so think post-1940s.
Okay.
He becomes very much into left politics and left activism. And eventually, he just becomes full-blown Marxist. And he writes this book, the dialectic... I actually forgot the name of it just now. But it's not important.
Who's the author again? I want to see if I can look up the full title.
Jean-Paul Sartre.
Sartre. Pardon the audience, I'm typing. Dialectical... Is it dialectical reason?
Yeah, that sounds right.
Okay.
It's probably dialectical reason. But supposedly this is the book that connects Marxism and existentialism, at least for Sartre, because what he does is say the question of who you are, who you will be, which are very existential questions, though those aren't the only existential questions there are. He says it is tied in undeniably with your material condition. And a lot of people read that as being the end of existentialism, which I find so interesting. Because to them, it's no longer existentialism, but it's Marxism, just dressed in a existential veneer, right? What's interesting about this play is that you get the sense that even if it's not technically like their material condition, actually, no, I was going to say there was a spiritual aspect. But actually, no, if you consider the Marxist Perchik, I think is how you pronounce his name.
Perchik.
Thank you. If you consider Perchik, he comes from a city.
Kiev.
Right, and when he comes to the village, he's saying, everything is changing. And you can't remain ignorant of the outside world anymore. And he's really the first change agent you see in the movie, where if not an agent, he heralds this new
what's about to happen,
right? And so there is this sense of the difference between your material conditions in a city versus a village, and where perhaps because a village life is more isolated and you can get away with maintaining your tradition and not being forced to change. Yeah,
and there's one character in the movie whose name I forget, but he always comes in with his newspaper telling everybody about what's going on, and they say, why don't you read something nice? He's like, it's not my fault, the paper printed it. And they were like, only bring us good news. But Perchik is those newspaper headlines come to life, and words on a page you can kind of ignore. But when it's a flesh and blood person who is very smart and is very honorable, and the rabbi doesn't entirely disagree with, you can't exactly fight it anymore.
Yeah. Well, it was interesting. The he arguably changes everyone during the wedding.
The dance.
Right? You talk about the rabbi, because he breaks the line between the men and the women, and and this is not allowed, he asked to dance with the women.
Mm-hmm.
And soon, everyone's into it, and someone, I forget who, someone grabs the rabbi, and the rabbi's like, okay.
And my favorite part is when they ask, he's like, Pritchard's like, well, go on, ask the rabbi. And he says, dancing, well, it's not expressly forbidden. And Tevye immediately cuts him off. There, not expressly forbidden. I'm going to dance with my wife.
Oh, good fun.
But what's sad is that in that moment of liberation is followed by the wedding being absolutely destroyed by Russian officers. And in the documentary, they're explaining about how Fiddler is set approximately in 1905. And around that time, that was when they had the first Russian Revolution that failed epically before the big one. And as a retaliation, the Russian government, looking for scapegoats, decided to take it out on the Jewish communities. And so you see the constable is kind of like this looming specter over the whole show. And that character is just so frustrating because it's somebody who can sort of, it's like he keeps missing the point. And he knows that the point is there, but he's failing to grab onto it. And he tries to say, why do you blame me? I had nothing to do with this. And it's like, no, you still had a choice. There were orders. You could have followed them. You didn't have to. And you see when they say, we want you to do a demonstration, which they do at Tevye's wedding, they completely destroy everything and burn everything to the ground, destroy all the wedding gifts that they got. He says, I don't know if I want to do this to these people, because he likes Tevye, but he, quote unquote, even though you're a Jew, which is like, well, screw you, dude. So he's like, I don't know if I want to do this. And he says, fine, if you're not going to do it, we'll replace you. And he's like, oh, wait a minute. And it's like, he keeps, it's kind of like, it reminds me of something that was said when I was in world history class, and we were talking about the film Hotel Rwanda and the Rwandan genocide. And there's a line in that movie where they're filming what's happening between the Hutu and the Tutsi, and someone says, I know it's going to happen. People are going to watch this on the news, and they're going to say, oh, that's too bad, and they're going to go back to eating their dinner because they don't care. And it reminds you of that. It's like, well, too bad, but I can't do anything about it. And it's like, yes, you can. You're in a position of power over these people, which is total bullshit that you have power over these people. But you have the power to step down and fight on their behalf. Oh, but no, you want the shiny promotion. You want the salary. You want your office. And so at the end, he's like, he looks around, and it's not exactly a moment of what have I done, like Sweeney has in Sweeney Todd, but he looks around and he resigns himself to, okay, this is how it's going to be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I don't actually have anything to add to that. I mean, you pretty much hit it. I think one of the interesting parts about existentialism is that it became most popular after World War II. And especially German existentialism and French existentialism, which those countries had a very personal history with World War II in very different ways. But there's this, and I don't know how long we've been going, but we can end on this if you like.
Been going for about 33 minutes.
Okay. So there's this existentialist called Karl Jaspers.
I've heard that name, yeah.
His work is very less known than your Nietzsche's or your Sartre's or Heidegger's, for that matter. Although him and Heidegger were contemporaries and were friends up until, Heidegger joined the Nazis.
Yeah.
But that's a story for another time.
We both don't like Heidegger.
We
really don't.
Don't get me started.
Do you want to tell the story about the student really quickly?
The student? Oh, Heidegger's student. Oh, goodness. Well, from what I understand, there was a student in Heidegger's class, and Heidegger basically sacked him and said, because he was reporting to the Nazi Party, and the student had written things
criticizing.
Well, let's say the student wasn't as nice as he could have been. Let's just say that. I don't know if he criticized it. That's why I'm hesitant. But anyway, the point about Jaspers. Jaspers is really interesting. After World War II, he was one of the few professors around his area who did not submit to Nazi regime. And by that I mean he just quit once he realized what was happening. So they asked Jaspers to come back, and he was asked to give a speech to the students and faculty, and he looked at them, and he said this: "The whole reason we're here is because we didn't go and fight for our German brothers and sisters." And he said, "I'm not saying that's right. I'm not saying that's wrong. But let's recognize that's why we're all alive." And the point about the point existentialism makes in response to World War II is that, there are no more excuses for our actions. We have to. You talked about people being responsible, despite all these, the warden being pressured. He could have done otherwise.
Yeah.
And existentialism, in response to World War II, is basically saying just that.
Yeah.
That you are responsible for your actions. And, I mean, the point Jaspers was making was, we could have fought.
Yeah.
All of us in this room, mind you, these are students and faculty.
Yeah.
So, he understood why they didn't start going out to the streets and start fighting the German occupation, right? Because at this time, well, anyway, point is, that line of, you need to take it upon yourself to fight these systems of oppression, and you don't have a excuse not to do so. Yeah. There's you want to. This is part of your personal responsibility. Very much made up the way existentialism grew up post World War II. And when you talk about the warden, that's exactly what that reminds me of.
Yeah. And this is why Fiddler is still, I think this is a good point to end on, so I'm just going to tie in a couple of things here. This is why Fiddler is still unfortunately relevant, because what happens to the village of Anatevka can happen anywhere. I mean, Jerome Robbins said that when he was directing the show, he was considering it to be, for him, an allegory to what was going on in the South in the KKK with the Civil Rights Movement. And, I'm sorry, I lost my place. Give me 1 minute. So it can happen anywhere, and it happens all the time with refugees, and bigotry still rears its ugly head, and every single production treats the closing number Anatevka with proper respect. And it's another reason people connect to the show. It helps them cope with loss and change. Like, I remember someone saying the song Sabbath Prayer, which is, in my opinion, one of the most beautiful songs in the movie. For some immigrants, for some Jewish immigrants in particular, the Sabbath meant more. After what happened in Russia after World War II, it meant more after that than it did before, because you want to create a world that you leave for your children before you pass on that was better than the one that you came into, and you want to have them pass down your traditions. And with the closing number, it reminds me with the theme that it's not fluff, it's life. We're not alone in our lives, and we're not alone in history. It reminds me of a statement I read from a Jewish person online, saying that similar to how black parents give their children the talk about how they could be shot for the color of their skin, they need to teach their children about the possibility of a pogrom in the U.S. because it could happen here too. And, Fran Lebowitz said, not many Jewish immigrants wanted to come here because of a burning longing. They came because they were either starving or they were being killed. And the closing number at the end of the show, the original song was called When the Messiah Comes. And the Messiah is referenced when Matel asked the question of the rabbi, "Rabbi, we've waited for the Messiah so long. Why doesn't he come now?" Which is a question that, to paraphrase, there was something about that written in one of the concentration camps in Germany. And the rabbi says to him, the Messiah will meet us in a better place. And the original song for this was called When Messiah Comes, which was a sarcastic song about the Messiah not being able to find Anatevka and getting lost, which is why he couldn't help the Jews when they were forced from their home. And it did get laughs on the recording, but not when they tried it out in Detroit, because the audience felt there needed to be a moment of poignancy and tragedy, because the pogroms and the forced relocation were atrocities, and to laugh at them felt awkward, so that number was cut and this was rewritten. And it's interesting because when Jerome Robbins staged Fiddler on the Roof, he had everything in a circle. He had the set in a circle. When the people arrive on stage, they're standing in a circle. And you don't see that in the film until the end, until they come to the crossroads and there's a circle of men standing there. And the circle begins to splinter and break off as they all go their separate ways. And, there are glimmers of hope when Tevye speaks to Hava again through shtetl. And when the fiddler goes with them, he doesn't leave, because they can't leave their spirit behind, but it still leaves you with a sobering gut punch to remind you that this really happened.
Okay. I think that's pretty...
A poignant place to end.
Poignant, yes.
Yeah, and an important place to end. All right, thank you so much for listening to our episode of Fiddler on the Roof. We hope that you'd enjoy it. Like, comment, subscribe, and all that jazz. Please share on social media if you are able to. We will be back next time with another musical. And we ended on a sobering note, but I would like to point out, but just say, in spite of it all, to life.
To life.
L'chaim. Bye.
Bye.